Reliability, validity are very important in content analysis. They're important in all the quantitative studies, but it's very important that you keep that in mind. And precision and operationalization of the variables that you're using will actually determine the quality of your study. Hi, hello again. I wanted to do a very quick video on methodology. I have several videos waiting, but I haven't had the time to create one properly. But I've been reviewing papers, and in this semester, I've reviewed a few papers, and I've realized even though most of the graduate students go through classes on methodology, they take a class or two, and it's sort of hard for them sometimes to understand the significance, the value, the importance of methodology. It makes all the difference in the way your study will be perceived, and especially if you're sending it for publication, because uh, the reviewers will actually check the, the study on various parameters. And let me explain. Now, especially if you're doing a study which would fall under anything that we consider quantitative. Traditionally, researchers don't separate between qualitative data and quantitative data because they think if we are collecting data, if any study is based on gathering data, then we are also looking, we call it quantitative and qualitative both, because you're gathering data which has some sort of number and measures and certain quantity, and you will clarify that. And then analysis is usually qualitative. However, the way I studied, there was one very interesting way of distinguishing between doing a qualitative or a quantitative analysis. And quantitative always was considered something where you subjected the data that you collected to statistical analysis. If you're not doing that, it becomes qualitative. I would say, that was the way we studied in the class, and that's not wrong. However, something like content analysis, which you are actually gathering data on and then you use descriptive analysis, can also be considered quantitative. Two important things that you need to remember when you are designing a study, and in this case, I'm going to talk, say, just about content analysis, because that was one of the things, one of the methodologies in one of the papers that I was reviewing. Is your study valid, and is your study reliable? Two things. Validity, which comes from varda, or just the truth, is, are you measuring what you said you are measuring? Did you say that I'm going to actually look at representation of environmental activists in North American newspapers, and you also included environmental lawyers in it? Unless you defined what you called activist, and that definition also included lawyers who were working on that behalf, then you can't simply say they're environmental activists. And how would you define? So in that case, operationalization, meaning how you define categories, becomes very important. That's how you realize what, okay, this is what I said I'm going to study, that's what I'm studying, and how I'm going to measure this, by being very clear about the definitions of what I'm studying. The second thing, when you send your paper for publication, would be reliability. Now, all journals are not going to be very specific about it depending on which kind of journal you send it to, but this is a gauge that you should have. What does reliability mean? In any specifically quantitative study where you have gathered data, you have gathered some numbers, and you're trying to make some descriptive analysis, or subjecting the data that you have gathered to statistical analysis, you need reliability, meaning if 10 years later somebody got the same sample that you chose, used the same methodology and definitions that you defined, they would come to exact same results that you do. I have seen, all sorts of studies these days, they don't fall into this, and sometimes it's sort of awkward. Many of them get published and whatnot because of this well, I don't want to get into that because there's a lot of issues in that aspect. However, keep that in mind to keep standards high for the studies that you're doing, especially if they are quantitative studies. And with regards to content analysis, if you're trying to study patterns in a content, say for example, you say we want to study representation of women in a certain television show, then you will specify why you chose that television show. You will also specify the kind of episodes you're taking, because the show could have run for 5 years and they probably have 300 episodes, and you're like, okay, which ones shall I choose? And then you need to define that. And then you would have to define what you mean by representation of women. Are you saying positive, negative? Then you have to come up with definition of all the variables. I'll talk about that at some point, that you are studying. That definition is called operationalization, which means you are defining how you looked at a certain variable, so that 10, 20, 50, 100 years later, somebody comes back and says, we think the study was done right or not done right. The sad part is that actually I know that, some studies get published and sometimes they're not completely verified. I'm sure that happens. But as a researcher, it is your duty to make sure that your study is both reliable and valid. Reliability is so important because that is also a mark of, because that actually shows whether or not your study can be taken seriously. If you came up with something and that study cannot be replicated, so reliability depends on replication of the study. Can you produce the same results using the same methodology? And that's very important in content analysis, because content analysis is done on something that, this thing took place, it happened, it's frozen in time, whether it's a media product, audiovisual, print, and nowadays you can have internet screenshots and whatnot. But that should be able to be replicated, and that can only be done if you have properly defined your categories, and methodology needs to be sound. Just something to keep in mind. I will come back and try to do more videos on different aspects of this. Okay, hope this helps. Let me know if you have questions and if I can clarify something. Thank you.